How can a molecule so small that it's invisible to the human eye convince the most complex organ in the known universe that it matters more than survival itself? Think about that for a moment. How can a few microscopic atoms eventually become more important than food, more important than sleep, sometimes even more important than the people someone loves most? At first, scientists believed the answer was simple. Some drugs were just stronger than others. But over the last few decades, neuroscience has uncovered something far stranger. The brain doesn't become addicted because it loves drugs. In fact, your brain was never designed to recognize drugs at all. It doesn't know what cocaine is. It doesn't know what heroin is. It doesn't know what nicotine, fentanyl, or methamphetamine are. Those molecules appeared far too recently in human history. Instead, your brain sees something completely different. It sees a signal that whispers one ancient message. This helps you survive, and that may be the greatest illusion any molecule has ever created. Because every addictive substance tells the brain a different story. Some convince it that you've suddenly found more energy. Some convince it that you've finally found safety. Some imitate relief. Some imitate connection. Others change reality itself. Different chemicals, different mechanisms, the same ancient survival system. And once the brain begins believing those signals, it quietly starts rewriting itself. Not in days, not even in weeks, but one tiny biological decision at a time. And that raises a fascinating question. If every addictive drug manipulates the same brain, why do they all feel so completely different? To answer that, we first need to understand the survival machine that has been protecting humans for millions of years. Because once you understand how that system works, you'll understand why addiction was never just about drugs. Before we can understand why different drugs affect the brain in such different ways, we need to understand the machine they all manipulate. For decades, dopamine was called the pleasure chemical. It sounded simple and convincing. But modern neuroscience tells a very different story. Imagine one of your ancestors discovering a river after days without water. The brain didn't release dopamine because finding water felt exciting. It released dopamine because survival had just improved. The message wasn't, "that felt good." It was, "remember this. Come back here. This matters." That's what dopamine really does. It assigns priority. Because the brain doesn't survive by chasing pleasure. It survives by remembering what keeps you alive. Deep inside the brain, a tiny structure called the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, acts like a biological alarm system. Whenever something seems important, it releases dopamine toward the nucleus accumbens, where the brain silently asks one question: should this become a habit? One final system keeps everything under control, the prefrontal cortex. This is the part that plans ahead, weighs consequences, and says, maybe this isn't a good idea. This is the most advanced part of the human brain. It's where planning, reasoning, self-control, and long-term thinking come together. For millions of years, these systems work together almost perfectly, and they form one of the most sophisticated survival systems evolution has ever created. They helped humans find food, avoid danger, build relationships, and survive. They were never designed for modern drugs, and that's exactly where every addictive substance begins cheating evolution. Each drug targets the same survival machine, but tells it a completely different lie. The first lie isn't the most dangerous. It's simply the one almost nobody questions. Every morning, millions of people reach for coffee before they've even fully opened their eyes. It feels like caffeine gives the brain more energy. But that's not what actually happens. Have you ever noticed that your first cup of coffee doesn't even wake you up anymore? That feeling isn't caffeine, it's adaptation. Throughout the day, a molecule called adenosine gradually builds up in the brain, creating the feeling of fatigue. Caffeine doesn't create energy, it simply blocks adenosine from delivering its message. For a while, your brain stops hearing that it's tired. The problem is that the brain always adapts. Over time, it creates more adenosine receptors to restore balance. That's the first lesson about addiction. The brain never stops learning. What lie does it teach the brain? You have more energy than you actually do. Why is quitting difficult? Without caffeine, all those extra adenosine receptors suddenly become active. Fatigue, headaches, and brain fog feel much stronger than normal. So, It's that your brain slowly forgets what natural energy feels like. Nicotine teaches a different lesson. Within seconds, it reaches the brain and activates nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, triggering dopamine release inside the survival circuit. But the cigarette isn't what the brain remembers most. It remembers the moment, the morning coffee, a stressful conversation. Over time, those ordinary moments become biological cues. Before the cigarette is even lit, dopamine begins rising in anticipation. The brain isn't responding to nicotine anymore. It's responding to the prediction. This is neuroplasticity in action. Every repetition strengthens the pathway until reaching for a cigarette becomes almost automatic, not because the brain wants nicotine, but because it has learned that this is the fastest route to relief. Your brain gets the message, relief is only one cigarette away. Why is it difficult to quit? Long before nicotine is gone, the brain is already craving the routine. Coffee, stress, driving, or social situations automatically trigger dopamine. It is not the nicotine. It's that ordinary moments become biological reminders to smoke. But here's where the story takes another turn. Energy isn't the strongest survival signal your brain protects. Feeling safe is. But here's something even more fascinating. Your brain can survive being tired. It can survive low energy. But it struggles much more when it stops feeling safe. Because for millions of years, safety wasn't a luxury. It was survival. Unlike caffeine or nicotine, the next group of drugs doesn't promise more energy. They promise something far more powerful: calm. Cannabis works through the endocannabinoid system, one of the brain's natural balancing networks. It helps regulate stress, sleep, appetite, and emotional stability. For many people, it temporarily quiets a racing mind and softens anxiety. The brain remembers that feeling. Over time, the endocannabinoid system relies more on external stimulation instead of practicing its own emotional regulation. The lesson the brain learns is, this is where calm and safety come from. Without cannabis, many people suddenly struggle to relax, sleep, or regulate anxiety because those skills are no longer practiced naturally. The trap isn't relaxation. It's slowly forgetting how to create calm on your own. What if the brain stops chasing safety and starts chasing motivation itself? Alcohol takes a different route. Instead of the endocannabinoid system, it amplifies GABA, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. Neural activity slows, anxiety fades, and the nervous system becomes quieter, but the brain never allows imbalance to last. Through a process called homeostasis, it constantly tries to restore equilibrium. As alcohol repeatedly suppresses brain activity, the nervous system gradually compensates by becoming more excitable. That's why heavy drinkers don't simply lose alcohol, they lose the break. Your brain learns silence can be poured into a glass. It becomes difficult when alcohol disappears because the brain is left in an overexcited state, causing tremors, anxiety, insomnia, and, in severe cases, delirium tremens. The trap is that the nervous system begins treating alcohol as part of its normal balance. Benzodiazepines, such as Xanax or Valium, strengthen this same GABA system even more directly. Used over time, the brain adapts again. GABA receptors become less responsive, a form of downregulation designed to maintain balance and provides the calming signal. What lie does it teach the brain? This pill is the only way to feel safe. Why is quitting difficult? Removing the drug can trigger severe rebound anxiety, insomnia, hallucinations, and seizures because the nervous system has lost its natural balance. What's the trap? The trap isn't feeling calm. It's that the brain no longer remembers how to create calm without the drug. And that raises another question. If the brain can be taught to depend on calm, what happens when a drug begins hijacking the very system that creates motivation itself? But here's the twist. Feeling safe is one thing. Feeling motivated is something entirely different. Because once the brain starts losing its natural ability to create motivation, it begins searching for shortcuts. And that's exactly where some of the most addictive drugs in the world take over. Unlike the drugs you've seen so far, stimulants don't promise peace. They promise possibility. Suddenly you're more focused, more alert, more confident. The world feels full of opportunities. Amphetamines achieve this by increasing dopamine and norepinephrine activity, pushing the brain into a state of artificial drive. The reward system becomes less responsive to natural dopamine, while tolerance steadily increases. The lesson the brain learns. This is what real motivation feels like. The difficulty to quit is, without the drug, even simple tasks feel exhausting because normal dopamine signaling no longer feels sufficient. The trap isn't productivity. It's that ordinary motivation starts feeling impossible. Cocaine takes a different approach. Instead of creating more dopamine, it blocks the dopamine transporter, preventing the brain from recycling it. The signal lingers far longer than it was ever meant to. For a brief moment, motivation feels limitless. But here's what the brain is actually learning. Not happiness and not pleasure. Importance. Every massive dopamine surge teaches the survival system the same lesson. Whatever caused this must matter. And that's where one of the most fascinating discoveries in neuroscience appears. Scientists call it reward prediction error. Your brain doesn't release its strongest dopamine signals when something simply feels good. It releases them when reality turns out to be better than expected. That's why uncertainty can become so addictive. Slot machines, social media notifications, gambling, even cocaine. The brain keeps chasing the possibility that the next reward might be even bigger than the last. The lesson it learns is simple. The next reward could be even better. That's why quitting becomes so difficult. The brain keeps chasing anticipation while ordinary life no longer feels rewarding. The trap isn't the high. It's the expectation of an even bigger one. Scientists once believed cocaine had created one of the fastest learning loops the brain could experience. They were wrong. Crack acts on the same dopamine system as cocaine, but speed changes everything. The dopamine surge arrives within seconds. The high is intense and disappears almost as quickly. That creates one of the most aggressive learning loops the brain can experience. Reward, crash, craving, repeat, again and again. Each cycle teaches the survival machine the same lesson. Relief is only one hit away. The brain begins predicting the next reward almost immediately, making the urge to repeat the cycle incredibly difficult to ignore. Why is quitting so difficult? Because the crash arrives almost immediately. The brain starts craving another hit before it has recovered from the last one. The problem isn't the dopamine surge, it's the speed of the crash that keeps restarting the cycle. But even that wasn't the worst damage scientists would discover. Methamphetamine changed something far more dangerous. What if a drug didn't just overwhelm the reward system? What if it slowly damaged the very machinery that creates motivation itself? Methamphetamine doesn't simply increase dopamine. It forces massive amounts of dopamine into the brain while disrupting norepinephrine and serotonin at the same time. During repeated use, neurons are pushed far beyond their normal limits. The brain is no longer just adapting. It may also be struggling to repair the very circuits that create motivation. Eventually, the brain stops asking, "What do I want?" It starts asking, "How do I feel anything at all?" That may be one of the cruelest biological consequences of addiction. Many people imagine addiction as constantly chasing pleasure. Meth reveals a much darker reality. People often stop taking it to feel amazing. They continue taking it because normal life no longer feels capable of producing enough motivation on its own. The survival machine has learned a devastating lesson. Without this, nothing matters. Without meth, many people experience profound exhaustion, emotional emptiness, and an inability to feel motivated. And that is the reason why quitting is so hard. It isn't the rush. It's that the brain gradually forgets how to generate motivation by itself. But even losing motivation isn't the most powerful survival signal of all, because evolution placed one system above almost everything else: the need to escape pain. Pain has protected every animal on Earth for millions of years. Without it, survival would be impossible. Opioids exploit that ancient warning system. By activating mu-opioid receptors, they reduce physical pain while simultaneously creating an overwhelming sense of comfort and emotional safety increasingly replaces the body's own pain relief system. Prescription opioids often open the door. What lie does it teach the brain? This is where suffering ends. And why is quitting difficult? Without opioids, both physical pain and emotional distress can feel amplified because the brain's own opioid system has been dialed down. It's that the brain slowly stops producing enough relief on its own. Heroin pushes much further, rapidly crossing into the brain where it is converted into morphine, producing an intense wave of relief while accelerating dependence. The lesson the brain learns is simple. Nothing removes suffering faster than this. Why is quitting so difficult? Withdrawal becomes so physically and emotionally intense that avoiding it becomes more motivating than seeking pleasure. The trap isn't euphoria. It's that withdrawal becomes more frightening than using again. Then came fentanyl, a synthetic opioid so extraordinarily potent that even microscopic amounts can overwhelm the same receptors. At first, it creates relief. Eventually, it replaces it. The brain gradually reduces its own endorphin production because the drug has taken over the job. The survival system begins believing, you cannot function without me. Many users no longer take fentanyl to feel good. They take it simply to avoid unbearable withdrawal. The trap isn't pleasure. It's that escaping suffering becomes the brain's new definition of survival. It's the survival system desperately searching for a signal it has stopped producing on its own. And that's what makes opioid addiction so devastating. The brain isn't chasing pleasure anymore. It's trying to escape suffering. But one final group of drugs tells a completely different lie. They don't promise more energy. They don't promise safety. They don't promise relief. They promise that reality itself can become something better, something deeper, something more meaningful. LSD and psilocybin work very differently from the drugs we've discussed so far. They rarely produce the severe physical dependence seen with opioids, alcohol, or stimulants. Instead, they primarily influence serotonin receptors, temporarily changing how different brain networks communicate. Thoughts become more flexible. Perception shifts. Ordinary experiences can suddenly feel deeply significant. The brain isn't learning that the drug creates pleasure. It's learning that reality itself feels more meaningful here. Over time, some people begin longing less for the substance and more for the perspective it created. The survival system quietly starts believing, the answers I'm searching for are found here. Why is quitting difficult? For most people, the addiction risk remains low, but psychological attachment can still develop when the brain begins associating personal growth, emotional relief, or self-understanding primarily with the psychedelic experience. The trap isn't the hallucination. It's believing that insight can only come from the substance. MDMA tells yet another story. Rather than simply increasing serotonin, it also releases large amounts of oxytocin, the hormone deeply involved in trust, bonding, and social connection, while also increasing dopamine and norepinephrine. For a few hours, emotional walls seem to disappear. Conversations feel effortless, touch feels meaningful, connection feels complete. But when those chemical levels fall, ordinary relationships may suddenly seem strangely muted by comparison. The brain remembers that contrast, not because it became addicted to love, because it learned that chemistry could imitate it. Different molecules, different pathways, different survival systems. Yet every one of them taught the brain the same illusion. No matter how different they looked, every one of them convinced the brain of the same ancient lie. This is how you survive. And that's exactly where addiction begins. Your brain never wanted drugs. It wanted energy, safety, motivation. It wanted relief, connection, survival. For millions of years, those instincts protected our species. They helped us find food, avoid danger, build families, stay alive. But evolution never prepared the human brain for molecules capable of perfectly imitating those ancient survival signals. The tragedy isn't that drugs fool the brain once. It's that repetition slowly convinces the brain that the lie is true, until one day the survival machine no longer asks, "Will this help me live?" It asks only one question: "Where can I find it again?" And in that moment, the brain hasn't become weak. It has become perfectly adapted to the wrong definition of survival, because the brain never recognizes the molecule. It only recognizes the survival signal the molecule imitates.